The blade came out of the darkness so fast that no one in the hall had time to shout a warning. King Draven Ashgrave felt the rush of air beside his throat, a heartbeat, before a gloved hand caught the attacker's wrist and twisted it back with brutal precision. The dagger clattered to the marble floor. The would-be killer dropped to his knees, groaning, pinned by a woman half his size but twice as fast. The entire throne room fell silent, torches flickering against stone walls that had never seen an attack this close to the king himself. Draven did not move. He stared at the guard standing over the attacker, her hood still shadowing half her face, her breathing calm, as if she had simply stepped outside for fresh air, rather than stopped an assassination. He knew her only as Alara, one of the quiet ones on his personal watch, a name he had signed off on a roster months ago without a second thought. "Take him to the lower chambers," Draven finally said, his voice steady, despite the tremor still running through his chest. 2 other guards rushed forward and dragged the attacker away, his cries fading down the corridor. The court began to murmur, nobles whispering behind painted fans, but Draven's eyes stayed fixed on Alara as she bent down, retrieved the fallen dagger, and offered it to him hilt first, her head bowed. "Your Majesty," she said simply, "you are unharmed." It was not a question, it was a statement, almost cold in its certainty, as if she had already calculated every possible outcome and settled on the correct one before it even happened. "I am," Draven answered, taking the dagger from her hand. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, and something in him, something ancient and beastly, that he kept locked beneath centuries of royal training, stirred without warning. He frowned, unsure what had caused it, and dismissed it as the aftershock of nearly dying in front of his entire court. Alara straightened, bowed once, and stepped back into the shadow of a nearby pillar, exactly where she had been standing before the chaos began. She did not linger for praise. She did not smile at the murmurs of admiration now rippling through the hall. She simply resumed her post as if nothing at all had happened, her eyes scanning the crowd for the next threat that might never come. Draven found himself staring at her a moment too long before Lord Cassian Vorith, his most trusted advisor and oldest friend, appeared at his elbow, his face pale with worry. "Your Majesty, we must move you to the West Tower immediately. If there was one, there could be more." "There won't be," Draven said, though he could not explain the certainty in his own voice. His gaze drifted back to Alara, still and silent by the pillar. Not with her watching. Cassian followed his gaze, raising an eyebrow, the quiet one. "Alara Voss, is it? I barely notice her most days. She never speaks in the barracks, never eats with the others, never asks for leave. Strange girl." "Strange," Draven repeated, though the word did not sit right in his mind. There was nothing strange about competence. There was nothing strange about calm. What unsettled him was the way his own pulse had not yet slowed, and it had nothing to do with the blade that had nearly opened his throat. That night, unable to sleep, Draven walked the empty corridors of Karath Castle, as he often did when his mind refused to rest. The kingdom he ruled was young in its peace, barely 5 years removed from a war that had cost him his father, his older brother, and nearly his own life. Sleep rarely came easily to a king who remembered too much and trusted too little. He walked past the Great Hall, past the war memorial etched with names he still recited in his private moments of grief, and out toward the eastern balcony that overlooked the training yards below. He was surprised to find he was not alone. Alara stood at the edge of the balcony, no longer in her guard uniform, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, instead of pulled back in its usual tight braid. She had not heard him approach, or if she had, she gave no sign of it. She was looking out at the moon, her posture different than it had been in the throne room, softer somehow, though her spine remained straight from years of discipline. "You are not on duty tonight," Draven said, more to announce his presence than to accuse her of anything. She turned quickly, surprise flashing across her face before she smoothed it into the same calm mask she always wore. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I could not sleep. I did not think anyone else would be awake at this hour." "Neither could I." He stepped closer, close enough to see that her eyes were a shade of gold he had never noticed before. Strange for a human woman, though many in his beast kingdom carried traces of animal blood in small, quiet ways. "You saved my life today." "I did my duty," she said simply, as if that were the end of the matter. Most who do their duty want something for it afterward. Recognition. Gold. A better post. Draven leaned against the balcony railing beside her, close enough now that he could catch the faint scent of her, something like rain on stone and wildflowers he could not name. You asked for nothing. I did not save you for a reward. Then why? Alara was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Draven thought she might not answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower, almost private, meant only for the space between them. Because it was right. Because a king who cannot trust his own hall to be safe cannot govern a kingdom that trusts him in return. I did not do it for you, your majesty. I did it for Karoth. It should have stung, hearing that her loyalty was to the land and not the man who ruled it. But instead, Draven found himself oddly pleased. Flattery he received daily, from courtiers and nobles who wanted favors, from women who wanted a crown of their own. Honesty, blunt and without artifice, was rarer than gold in his court, and Alara had just handed it to him without hesitation. Karoth is fortunate to have you then, he said. She glanced at him, something unreadable passing behind her golden eyes, and for a moment Draven thought she might smile. She did not. Instead she bowed her head slightly and stepped back toward the shadows of the corridor. I should return to my quarters, your majesty. Dawn comes early for the watch. Alara, he said her name before he could stop himself, and she paused, half turned away from him. Thank you. For today. You already thanked me, she said, and this time there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. Good night, your majesty. He watched her disappear down the darkened hall, her footsteps silent even on the old stone floor, a skill that spoke of years of training most guards never bothered to master. Draven remained on the balcony long after she had gone, staring at the moon she had been watching, wondering why the ordinary act of a woman standing quietly under moonlight had unsettled him more than the dagger that had nearly ended his life. Over the following days, Draven noticed things about Alara he had somehow overlooked before. She was always positioned closest to him during council meetings, though never close enough to be improper, her eyes tracking every servant, every noble, every shift in the room with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself before it struck. She ate alone in the corner of the barracks hall, declining invitations from the other guards without unkindness, simply with a quiet firmness that discouraged further asking. She trained before dawn, when the yards were empty, moving through forms that seemed older and stranger than the standard drills taught to Karoth's soldiers, forms that reminded him faintly of techniques from beast clans in the northern territories, clans that had been scattered and lost during the war. He told himself his curiosity was simply the caution of a king who wanted to understand the woman now closest to his safety. He told himself the way his beast stirred whenever she was near was nothing more than lingering instinct from the attack, a protective response with no deeper meaning. He told himself many things in those first days, and none of them fully satisfied the questions building quietly beneath his ruler's composure. Cassian noticed the shift before Draven was willing to admit it himself. You watch her the way you used to watch the battlefield, Cassian said one evening, as they reviewed reports of a border dispute in the eastern provinces. Careful, calculating, as if you are waiting for her to reveal something. I am simply grateful, Draven said, not looking up from the parchment in front of him. She saved my life. It would be strange not to notice the woman who did that. Cassian did not sound convinced, but he let the matter rest, turning the conversation instead to the growing unrest along the northern border, where rumors spoke of a rival beast clan gathering strength after years of quiet exile. Draven listened, nodded in the right places, offered the correct commands, but his mind kept drifting back to golden eyes under moonlight and a voice that spoke of duty to a kingdom rather than loyalty to a king. It was a small thing, a quiet thing, the kind of feeling a man could easily dismiss in the daylight hours when duty filled every corner of his attention. But at night, when the castle grew silent and his thoughts belonged only to himself, Draven found he could not stop wondering about the guard, who never smiled, never asked for anything, and yet had somehow, without a single word of pursuit, begun to occupy a space in his mind that no one else had ever reached. He did not yet understand what was happening to him. He only knew that for the first time since the crown had settled on his head, He found himself looking forward to the quiet hours of the night, not for the peace they offered, but for the chance that he might see her again. Word of the attempted attack spread through the castle before sunrise, and by the time Draven took his seat for the morning council, every noble present seemed eager to offer their own theory about who had ordered the strike and why. Some blamed rival territories still bitter over old trade disputes. Others whispered of enemies within the court itself, jealous of Draven's growing influence since the war's end. None of them mentioned Alara by name more than in passing, a footnote to the larger political drama they were far more interested in dissecting. Draven found the omission strange. A guard who had single-handedly stopped an assassination in front of the entire court deserved more than a passing mention, yet the nobles seemed content to treat her as simply part of the machinery that kept them safe, unremarkable in their eyes, precisely because she had done her job so well that the danger never had a chance to become a true crisis. He wondered, not for the first time, whether Alara preferred it that way, whether the anonymity she seemed to cultivate so carefully was a shield she had built for reasons far older than her time in his service. He caught himself watching the door of the council chamber more than once that morning, half expecting her to appear, even though guards were rarely summoned to sit among the nobility. When the session finally ended and he stepped out into the corridor, he found himself walking not toward his private study, as he usually did, but toward the barracks wing, where the castle guard kept their quarters, telling himself the visit was simply a matter of security review, nothing more. Smoke rolled across the feast hall before the first scream even left anyone's throat. One moment, the long tables were filled with laughter and wine, ambassadors from 3 neighboring territories raising toasts to a fragile new peace, and the next moment, a clay pot shattered against the marble floor, and thick gray fumes swallowed half the room. Draven staggered back from the head table, his eyes burning, his beast instincts screaming at him before his conscious mind could even process the danger. Through the haze he saw shapes moving, too fast to be servants, too coordinated to be panicked guests. Steel rang against steel somewhere to his left. A woman's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the chaos. "Get the ambassadors to the side exit, now." It was Alara. Draven turned toward the sound of her voice, just as a masked figure lunged at him from the smoke, blade raised. He barely had time to raise his arm before Alara was there, intercepting the attacker with a speed that seemed impossible, disarming him in 2 swift movements, and driving him back into the wall hard enough that he slumped, unconscious, at her feet. She did not pause to admire her work. She was already moving to the next threat, shouting orders to the other guards, directing the panicked nobles toward the exits, with a calm authority that cut through the smoke and screaming like a blade through silk. A second attacker came from Draven's blind side, and this time there was no one close enough to intercept in time. The blade caught him across the ribs, shallow but burning, and he grunted in pain, stumbling against an overturned table. His beast nearly broke free then, claws lengthening beneath his skin, a low growl building in his throat. But before the transformation could take hold, Alara was there again, her forearm catching the attacker's wrist and twisting until bone cracked, and the man dropped his weapon with a howl of pain. "Stay behind me," she ordered, and for once, Draven, king of Karoth, did exactly as he was told. The chaos lasted only minutes more, before the castle guard flooded the hall, and the remaining attackers either fled or were captured. Smoke cleared slowly, revealing overturned tables, shattered glass, and a hall full of terrified nobility, clutching their finest garments, as if fabric could protect them from steel. Draven pressed a hand to his ribs, feeling the warm slide of blood beneath his fingers, and for the first time that night, allowed himself to feel the pain he had been ignoring. "You are hurt," Alara said, appearing at his side the moment the immediate danger passed. Her hands, steady despite everything that had just happened, pulled his own away from the wound to examine it properly. "But it needs tending." "I have healers for that," Draven said, though he made no move to call for one. "Healers who were also in this hall, and who may still be shaken." Alara's voice held no argument in it, only fact. "Let me see to it until one is free. I have field training. It will not be pretty, but it will hold." He should have refused. A king did not allow a common guard to tend his wounds when a full staff of trained physicians existed for exactly that purpose. But something in her tone, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of fear even after everything that had just happened, made him nod instead. They retreated to a small antechamber off the main hall, away from the noise and the frightened murmurs of the court, trying to piece together what had happened. Ilara worked quickly, cutting away the ruined fabric of his tunic with a small knife from her belt, cleaning the wound with water and a strip of clean cloth, her touch far gentler than Draven expected from hands that had just broken a man's wrist without hesitation. "You fight well," Draven said, watching her work, trying to distract himself from the sting of the cleaning. "Better than most of my personal guard. Where did you train?" Her hands paused for the briefest moment before continuing their work. "Here and there, I have moved often." "That is not an answer. It is the only one I have to give tonight, Your Majesty." She tied off the bandage with practiced efficiency and sat back, finally meeting his eyes. Up close, in the dim candlelight of the antechamber, he could see the faint golden ring around her irises more clearly than ever before, and beneath it, something guarded, something that spoke of old wounds, hidden far deeper than the visible kind. "You keep a great many things to yourself," Draven observed. "As does every good guard, Your Majesty. Trust is built slowly. It is not something I hand out freely, even to a king." She rose to her feet, smoothing down the front of her uniform, the mask of calm professionalism sliding back into place, as easily as she had cut away his ruined tunic. "You should rest. The healers will want to examine the wound properly once things have settled." "Ilara." He caught her wrist gently before she could step away, and felt her stiffen at the contact, though she did not pull back. "Twice now you have put yourself between me and a blade. That is not simply duty. Duty does not move that fast, without hesitation, without a single thought for your own safety." "Perhaps I am simply very good at my duty," she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. "Perhaps," Draven agreed, releasing her wrist. "Or perhaps you are something more than a guard who happened to be assigned to my watch." She said nothing to that, only bowed her head and left the antechamber without another word, leaving Draven alone with his thoughts and the dull ache in his side that felt smaller, somehow, than the ache of watching her walk away. In the days that followed the attack, the investigation into the assassination attempt consumed the court. Cassian worked tirelessly with the castle guard to trace the attackers back to their source, uncovering fragments of a plot that pointed toward a rival faction within the northern beast clans, the same clans whose unrest had been growing along the border for months. Draven attended council meeting after council meeting, listening to reports of interrogations and captured correspondence, his mind only half present as his thoughts kept drifting to the woman who had saved his life twice in the same night and refused to explain how she had learned to fight the way she did. He began to seek her out, not through official summons that would draw the attention of the court, but through smaller, quieter means. He took to walking the training yards in the early mornings, when he knew she practiced alone before the other guards arrived. At first he simply watched from a distance, studying the strange, fluid forms she moved through, forms that bore little resemblance to the standard Karoth combat style. When she noticed him watching, she did not stop, only acknowledged him with a brief nod before continuing her practice, as if his presence there had become something expected rather than intrusive. "You move like someone from the old northern clans," Draven said one morning, finally breaking the silence between them as she paused to catch her breath. "The stance you use, the way you distribute your weight before a strike. My father's soldiers trained with warriors from those clans, before the war scattered them." Something flickered across Ilara's face, there and gone so quickly that Draven almost missed it. "I have picked up techniques from many places, Your Majesty. A guard who wishes to survive learns from wherever she can." "You never answer a question directly," he said, not unkindly, more amused than frustrated by the pattern he had come to recognize in her. "I answer as directly as I am able," she replied, and there was something almost like humor in her tone now, a lightness he had not heard from her before. It surprised him how much he wanted to hear it again. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following weeks, though neither of them named it for what it was becoming. Draven would find reasons to walk past the training yards, and Ilara would find reasons to linger a few minutes longer than her duty required. He began inviting her to join his private council walks along the castle gardens, framing the invitations as security briefings, though the conversations rarely stayed on the topic of threats and defenses for long. She spoke little of her past, but she spoke freely of small things, of books she had read in stolen hours, of the way the mountains looked at dawn from the northern watchtower, of a dry, unexpected wit that emerged only when she believed no one important was listening closely enough to judge her for it. Draven found himself laughing more in her presence than he had in years, a fact that did not go unnoticed by the rest of his court. "The king walks the gardens with his guard again," one of the older nobles murmured during a formal dinner, not quite quietly enough to escape Draven's hearing. Strange, is it not, for a man of his station, to spend so much time with someone so far beneath him? Draven said nothing, though the comment settled uncomfortably in his chest. He had not considered, until that moment, how the growing closeness between himself and Alara might appear to those who did not understand it, who saw only a king and a common guard, rather than the strange, quiet connection that had grown between them like something patient and inevitable. Alara, for her part, seemed increasingly aware of the same danger. She began to pull back in small ways, arriving a few minutes late to their morning walks, finding reasons to decline his invitations to walk the gardens after dusk. When he asked her about it directly, she only shook her head and said, "It is not wise, Your Majesty. A king and his guard, people will talk, and talk becomes trouble, especially now, with the northern clans stirring, and the court already searching for reasons to distrust anyone close to you." "Let them talk," Draven said, though even as he said it, he understood the risk was not so simple to dismiss. A kingdom recovering from war needed stability, needed a king whose choices could not be twisted into weakness or scandal by enemies looking for any excuse to strike again. "You are a king," Alara said quietly, not looking at him, her eyes fixed instead on the horizon beyond the garden wall. "A king cannot simply want something and have it, no matter how much he wishes otherwise. There are always consequences. I would rather step back now than become one of them." Her words stayed with him long after she had excused herself that evening, retreating once again into the careful distance she had maintained since the night of the feast hall attack. Draven stood alone in the garden, the scent of night-blooming flowers heavy in the air, and admitted to himself, finally, plainly, what he had been avoiding for weeks. He did not simply admire Alara Voss for her skill or her loyalty. He wanted her, in a way that had nothing to do with duty or gratitude, in a way that frightened him precisely because he could not explain where it had come from, or how quickly it had taken root. And though every instinct born of his royal training told him to be cautious, to guard his heart the way he guarded his kingdom, the beast beneath his skin, the ancient part of him that had stirred the very first night he met her golden eyes, refused to be silenced so easily. Something was calling to him whenever she was near, quiet but insistent, and he was beginning to suspect that whatever it was, it went far deeper than simple affection. The investigation into the feast hall attack uncovered little in the days that followed. The captured attackers spoke only in fragments, refusing to name whoever had hired them, though Cassian noted that both men carried small tokens etched with a symbol none of the castle scholars could immediately identify, a broken shape that looked almost like a crown split down the middle. He kept the discovery quiet for the time being, unwilling to alarm the court until the palace historians had time to research its origin properly. Draven, meanwhile, found his attention split between the growing political pressure to identify the culprits and the quieter, more persistent pull toward Alara that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. He noticed small things about her he had never had reason to observe so closely before, the way she always positioned herself with a clear line of sight to every exit, the faint calluses on her fingers that spoke of years handling a bow rather than simply a sword, the careful way she avoided mentioning any family or hometown whenever conversation drifted toward personal history. One afternoon, while reviewing security rotations with the head of his guard, Draven asked, almost too casually, how long Alara had served in Karoth's ranks. "Nearly 3 years, Your Majesty," the guard captain answered, flipping through his ledgers. "Came to us with strong references from a border garrison, though I confess, I never looked too closely into where she trained before that. Her skill spoke for itself during evaluation. We do not often turn away talent that good, regardless of where it comes from." "No," Draven agreed slowly. "I imagine you would not." The answer told him little more than he already knew, but it deepened the quiet curiosity that had settled into him since the night of the attack, a curiosity that felt less like idle interest and more, with each passing week, like something he could not simply set aside no matter how often duty demanded his attention elsewhere. The garden walks became a regular fixture of his week, though he was careful never to schedule them so often that they drew undue notice from the court. Alara remained guarded in most of their conversations, but small cracks began to show in her careful composure, moments where her wit slipped past her defenses, or her laughter, rare and startling in its warmth, escaped before she could catch herself. Draven found himself treasuring those small moments more than any formal council victory, more than any praise offered by visiting dignitaries impressed by his handling of the kingdom's recovery. It was during one such walk, beneath the flowering vines along the southern garden wall, that Alara finally asked him a question of her own, something she had never done before in all their conversations. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "The crown. The weight of it. You were so young when it fell to you." Draven considered the question carefully before answering, surprised by how much he wanted to give her an honest response, rather than the practiced deflection he usually offered anyone who asked about his burdens. "There are nights I regret it deeply," he admitted. "Nights when I think of my brother, who should have worn this crown instead of me, who would have worn it better. But there are other moments, quieter ones, where I find myself grateful for the chance to build something better than what came before. Moments like this one, perhaps." Alara's steps slowed, and for a long moment she said nothing, though something in her expression softened, in a way Draven had rarely seen from her. "I understand regret," she said finally. "And I understand, too, the strange comfort of finding something unexpected in the middle of it." Neither of them spoke of what exactly that unexpected comfort might be, but the words lingered between them, long after the walk ended, a quiet acknowledgement of something neither was yet ready to name aloud. A raven struck the window of the War Council chamber so hard the glass cracked, and the message tied to its leg carried news that sent every noble in the room to their feet at once. Draven read the report twice before he trusted his own eyes. A trading caravan bound for the northern border had been ambushed 3 nights ago. Every guard slaughtered, every crate of grain and steel stolen, and carved into the wagon's splintered wood was a symbol Karoth had not seen in 5 years. The broken crown of the Thornvale clan, the very faction his father had defeated in the final battle of the war. "They should not exist anymore," Cassian said, his voice tight with disbelief, as he stared at the sketch of the symbol. "We scattered them. Their leaders were executed or exiled. There is nothing left of the Thornvale line. Apparently, there is enough left to organize an ambush and leave a message," Draven said grimly, setting the report down on the long table. "Double the patrols along the eastern trade routes. I want scouts in the Whisperwood by nightfall. If Thornvale is rebuilding, I want to know how, and I want to know why they are moving against us now, after 5 years of silence." The council dispersed to carry out his orders, but Draven lingered, staring at the crude sketch of the broken crown, a familiar unease settling in his chest. He had grown up on stories of the war, of his father's final campaign against the Thornvale clan, a beast faction so vicious in their pursuit of power that they had turned even their own kind against them, slaughtering rival clans who refused to bow to their rule. His father had called it a war of necessity, a war to protect Karoth and every smaller clan the Thornvale had threatened to consume. Draven had been young then, too young to fight, but old enough to remember the smoke on the horizon and the names of the dead recited at his father's funeral years later, casualties of wounds that never fully healed. He found Alara in the training yard that evening, moving through her forms in the fading light, and something about the ambush report made him watch her more carefully than usual, noting again the strange fluidity of her movements, the northern clan techniques she claimed to have simply picked up along the way. "We received word of an attack near the eastern border," he said, watching her carefully as he spoke. "Thornvale symbols were found at the scene." Alara froze mid-motion, her sword arm suspended in the air, for one long, telling second, before she lowered it slowly. "Thornvale," she repeated, and something in her voice had changed entirely, gone flat and careful, in a way Draven had never heard from her before. "Are you certain?" Cassian confirmed it himself. The broken crown, carved into the wagon. Draven stepped closer, studying the way her jaw had tightened, the way her hands had curled slightly at her sides. "You know something about them." "Everyone in Karoth knows the stories of the war, Your Majesty." Her voice was too even now, too controlled, the mask sliding firmly back into place. "I am not asking about stories," Draven said quietly. "I am asking about you. You know these clan fighting techniques. You disappear whenever anyone asks too closely about your past. And now, At the mention of a clan everyone believed destroyed, you look as though you have seen a ghost. He reached out, not quite touching her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand hovering near her arm. Ilara, whatever you are hiding, I need to know if it puts this kingdom in danger. She was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond him, somewhere in the past he could not reach. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all of its usual composure, thin and quiet, in a way that made his chest ache. I need time, Your Majesty. Please. I will tell you what I know, but not tonight. Not like this. He wanted to press further, wanted to demand the truth immediately. King and guard be damned. But something in her expression, a rawness he had never seen from her before, stopped him. He nodded instead, though the unease in his chest had only grown heavier. Tomorrow, then, I will hold you to it. She did not answer, only bowed her head and walked quickly toward the barracks, leaving Draven alone in the darkening yard with more questions than he had started with. 3 nights later, scouts confirmed a second ambush, this time on a supply convoy just beyond the Whisperwood, the dense forest that marked the border between Karoth's settled lands and the wilder northern territories. Draven rode out himself with a small company of guards, including Ilara, whose skill in tracking and combat had made her an obvious choice despite Cassian's private objections, that the king should not put himself in unnecessary danger, while the threat remained unidentified. The forest was quiet, in a way that unsettled every soldier in the company, the usual sounds of birds and small creatures, conspicuously absent as they moved deeper along the trail toward the ambush site. Draven rode near the front, his senses sharpened by his beast instincts, aware of every shift in the wind, every rustle of leaves that might signal danger. Ilara rode close behind him, her bow strung and ready, her eyes scanning the tree line with the same practiced vigilance she brought to every task. The attack came just after moonrise, arrows hissing from the darkness on both sides of the trail. Draven's horse reared, and he threw himself clear just as a second volley cut through the space where he had been standing moments before. Chaos erupted around him, steel ringing against steel, the shouts of his guards mixing with the guttural cries of attackers, who moved through the trees with the eerie coordination of trained beast warriors, rather than common bandits. Draven's beast surged forward without his permission this time, claws lengthening, his vision sharpening into the heightened focus of his true nature, as he met the first attacker head-on, disarming him with brutal efficiency, honed by years of training he had hoped never to need again. Around him, his guards fought back the ambush, but the attackers were skilled, better organized than any bandit force he had encountered since the war's end. It was in the chaos of battle, with moonlight filtering through the canopy above, and the metallic scent of exertion thick in the air, that everything changed for Draven, in a single, staggering instant. Ilara fought a few paces away, her braid loosened from combat, strands of dark hair falling across her face as she moved through her opponents, with a speed and precision that seemed almost otherworldly. And as Draven turned to check on her, to make certain she remained unharmed amid the chaos, a gust of wind carried her scent directly to him, stronger now than it had ever been before, sharpened by adrenaline and effort. His entire body went rigid. It was her. The scent he had caught faint traces of on quiet nights, the scent that had stirred something ancient and restless beneath his skin, from the very first moment he met her, the scent that every instinct of his beast nature now recognized with a certainty that could not be denied or explained away as coincidence. Mate. The word rose unbidden in his mind, ancient and absolute, a truth carried in the blood of every beast king before him, a bond so rare that most rulers of Karoth never found it in their entire lifetimes. He had heard stories of it as a child, of how a beast king would know his true mate the instant her scent crossed his senses, in a moment of heightened emotion, how the bond could not be faked, could not be mistaken for simple attraction or affection. He had never expected to feel it. He had certainly never expected to feel it for the quiet guard who had spent months at his side, deflecting every question about her past with careful, practiced evasion. An attacker lunged at him from his blind side, and pure instinct saved his life, his beast reflexes taking over, even as his conscious mind reeled from the revelation that had just struck him with the force of a physical blow. He dispatched the threat quickly, but his eyes never left Ilara, watching her fight with new understanding, seeing not just a skilled guard but something far more significant, something the ancient blood in his veins had just confirmed beyond any possibility of doubt. The battle ended as quickly as it began, the attackers retreating into the deeper forest once it became clear the ambush had failed to catch Karoth's forces unprepared. Draven's guards regrouped, checking for wounded, securing the trail, but Draven remained still for a long moment, staring at Alara across the clearing, his chest heaving with more than simple exertion. She noticed his stare and crossed the distance between them, concern flickering across her features. "Your Majesty, are you injured?" "No," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "No, I am not injured." He studied her face in the moonlight, searching for something he could not yet name, some confirmation that she felt what he had just felt, some sign that the bond that had just seized his entire being was not his alone to carry. Alara's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping into her golden eyes as she took in his intense scrutiny. "Your Majesty, you are looking at me strangely." "Alara," he said quietly, stepping closer despite the guards moving around them, despite the danger that had only just passed. "Do you feel it too?" Confusion crossed her face for a moment, before understanding dawned, sudden and sharp, her entire body going rigid, the same way his had only minutes before. Her breath caught audibly, and for the first time since he had known her, Draven watched pure, unguarded fear flood across her carefully composed features. "No," she whispered, stepping back from him as though he had struck her. "No, this cannot be happening." "Alara, I need to check the perimeter," she said quickly, her voice cracking with something he had never heard from her before, something desperate. Before he could stop her, before he could say another word, she turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with the same silent, practiced speed that had first drawn his attention months ago, leaving Draven standing alone in the clearing, with the moon overhead and a truth burning in his chest that he could no longer ignore. Cassian found him there minutes later, his expression grim as he surveyed the aftermath of the ambush. "We lost 2 guards, 3 more wounded, though they should recover. The attackers were well trained, Your Majesty. This was not the work of common raiders." Draven barely heard him, his mind still consumed by the sight of Alara fleeing into the darkness, by the fear he had seen in her eyes, by the word that had settled into his very bones with a certainty he could not shake. Mate. His mate. A woman who carried secrets deep enough to send her running at the mere suggestion of the bond between them. "Your Majesty?" Cassian pressed, studying him with growing concern. "You seem distracted." "I am fine," Draven said, though the words felt hollow, even to his own ears. He looked toward the trees where Alara had disappeared, his heart pounding with something far more complicated than the adrenaline of battle. "Cassian, I need you to find out everything you can about Alara Voss, where she came from, who trained her, everything." Cassian's eyebrows rose slightly, but he did not question the order, only nodded, and gestured for the company to prepare for the return journey to the castle. Draven mounted his horse in silence, his eyes scanning the tree line one final time, searching for any sign of the woman who had just fled from the truth of what they were to each other, a truth that ancient beast blood did not offer and then simply take back. He did not know yet what secrets she carried, what past she had spent so long trying to bury, beneath careful silence and evasive answers. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his chest and refused to loosen, that whatever those secrets were, he would not let her face them alone. Not now, not when the bond between them had finally revealed itself, undeniable and absolute, beneath the cold light of a northern moon. The ride back to the castle was quiet, tense with the aftermath of battle, and the questions Draven could not yet voice aloud. Alara rejoined the company just before they reached the gates, her expression carefully composed once again, though Draven could see the tightness around her eyes, the careful distance she maintained from him for the remainder of the journey. She did not look at him again, until they reached the castle courtyard, and when she finally did, her golden eyes carried a warning he understood without words. Whatever secrets she carried, she was not ready to share them yet, but Draven had already decided, somewhere in the quiet clearing beneath the moonlight, that he would wait for as long as it took, because a bond like this, ancient and undeniable, was not something either of them could outrun forever. Back at the castle, Draven called an emergency session of the War Council before the sun had fully risen, the events of the ambush still weighing heavily on every mind in the room. Cassian presented the recovered evidence from the battlefield, arrows marked with the same broken crown symbol found at the earlier ambush sites, along with a torn scrap of cloth, bearing traces of a dye, used almost exclusively in the northern territories once controlled by the Thornvale clan before the war. This was not a random encounter, Cassian said grimly, spreading the evidence across the council table. Whoever organized this attack knew our patrol routes, knew when a company would be moving through the Whisperwood, and structured the ambush with clear military precision. This speaks to organization we have not seen from any hostile force since the war's end. Increase patrols along the entire eastern border, Draven ordered, though his mind kept drifting back to the moment in the clearing, when the mate bond had revealed itself so suddenly and completely. And I want a full accounting of every guard currently serving within the castle walls, their history, their training, everything we have on record. Cassian raised an eyebrow at the addition to his orders, but did not question it in front of the assembled council, waiting instead until the room had cleared, before approaching Draven privately. You are asking for records on the entire guard, Your Majesty. Is there something specific you are looking for? Or someone? Draven hesitated, unwilling yet to share the full truth of what he suspected, of the bond that had settled into his very bones during the chaos of battle. Call it caution, he said finally. After tonight, I want to know exactly who stands closest to me, and why. Cassian studied him for a long moment, clearly unconvinced by the vague explanation, but he did not press further, simply nodding and promising to have the records compiled by morning. Draven remained in the council chamber long after his old friend had departed, staring at the map of the eastern border, the marked locations of both ambushes glaring back at him like an accusation he did not yet fully understand. He thought of Alara's reaction to the mention of Thornvale, the way her entire demeanor had shifted from calm composure to barely restrained fear in the span of a single sentence. He thought of the ancient forms she practiced in the training yard each morning, forms that Cassian's own soldiers could not identify despite years of military service. He thought, most of all, of the scent that had struck him so suddenly in the clearing, undeniable and absolute, marking her as his mate, in a way that defied every rational explanation his mind tried to construct. Whatever secrets Alara carried, Draven understood now that they were tangled inextricably with the very threat now gathering along his kingdom's borders. And though the ancient bond compelled him toward trust, toward protection, toward a devotion that felt both sudden and inevitable, the king in him understood that trust alone would not be enough to navigate whatever conflict was coming. He needed the truth, however painful it might prove to be, and he needed it soon, before the growing threat from the north forced choices that neither of them would be able to easily undo. Alara did not report for duty the next morning, and by midday, Draven's patience had worn to nothing. He found her quarters empty, her belongings still there but her presence gone, and the guards on watch reported only that she had left before dawn, heading toward the old chapel at the edge of the castle grounds, a place rarely visited except by those seeking solitude away from the noise of court life. He found her sitting on the stone steps of the chapel, staring out at the training yards below, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She heard him approach and did not turn, though her shoulders tensed visibly at the sound of his footsteps. You cannot avoid me forever, Draven said, keeping his voice gentle, despite the frustration building beneath his calm exterior. Not after last night. I am not avoiding you, Your Majesty. I simply needed time to think. Alara. He sat down beside her on the cold stone steps, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, though he was careful not to crowd her. Tell me what frightened you so much that you ran from me in the middle of a battlefield. She was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on some point far beyond the training yards, beyond the castle walls, somewhere in a past she had clearly worked hard to bury. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, stripped of the careful composure she usually wore like armor. My real name is not Alara Voss, she said. It is Alara Thornvale. The name struck Draven like a physical blow, and for a moment he could only stare at her, the pieces of a puzzle he had not even realized he was assembling, suddenly clicking into place with terrible clarity. The fighting techniques, the evasive answers, the way she had gone rigid at the mention of the ambush symbols the night before. You are of the Thornvale clan, he said slowly, testing the words, watching her flinch at the sound of them. I was the daughter of their last chieftain, Alara said, her voice steadier now, that the truth was finally out, though pain still colored every word. I was 7 years old when your father's forces marched against my clan. I do not remember much of the war itself, only fragments. Smoke, screaming, my mother pushing me into a hidden passage beneath our home and telling me to run and not look back, no matter what I heard. She paused, drawing in a slow breath. I never saw her again, or my father, or anyone else I knew as a child. I was found 3 days later by a traveling merchant, half-starved and unable to speak, and he took pity on me, gave me a new name, and raised me as his own daughter, far from anything connected to the Thornvale line. Draven's chest tightened, old memories of his father's war campaign resurfacing with new, painful context. He had grown up hearing that campaign framed as necessary, as justice against a clan that had terrorized its neighbors for years. He had never considered the children who might have been caught in the aftermath, the innocent lives reshaped forever by a conflict they had no part in starting. I trained in secret for years, Ilara continued, not out of any desire for revenge, but because I never wanted to feel as helpless as I did that night, hiding in the dark while everything I knew burned around me. I learned the old clan techniques from what few texts and memories I could piece together, techniques passed down through generations of Thornvale warriors before the clan turned toward the darker path that led to its own destruction. When I was old enough, I sought a position as a guard, first in smaller territories, and eventually here, in Karoth, in the very kingdom that ended my family's line. Why here? Draven asked quietly. Of all places, why come to serve the kingdom that destroyed your clan? Ilara finally turned to look at him, her golden eyes bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. Because I wanted to understand. I wanted to see the kingdom my clan had supposedly threatened, to see if the stories I had heard were true, if the war had truly been necessary, or if it had simply been a convenient excuse for a young, ambitious king to expand his territory and eliminate a rival. And what did you find? Draven asked, though he was almost afraid of the answer. I found a kingdom trying to heal from its own wounds. I found a king who carried guilt for a war he did not start, and grief for a father he lost too young. I found people who wanted peace, not conquest. Her voice softened, and for a moment the careful walls she had built around herself seemed to crack entirely. I found reasons to stay far beyond what I ever expected, and then I found myself caring for a king I once believed I should have hated, in ways I never anticipated and never wanted to admit, even to myself. Draven reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and when she did not, he gently took her hand in his. Ilara, none of what happened to your clan was your doing. You were a child. Whatever darkness the Thornvale leadership fell into before the war, it was not yours to carry. You do not understand, she said, her voice breaking slightly. If the court discovers who I truly am, they will not see an innocent child who survived a tragedy. They will see the last living heir of a clan that once threatened this very kingdom. They will see a threat, Draven, not a guard, not someone who has spent years proving her loyalty through service. And now, with Thornvale symbols appearing at recent attacks, with someone clearly trying to rebuild what your father destroyed, my presence here becomes even more dangerous, both to myself and to you. It was the first time she had ever used his name without his title, and something in him settled at the sound of it, even amid the weight of everything she had just revealed. You believe the attacks are connected to your clan's remnants, he said, understanding dawning slowly. You think someone is trying to rebuild the Thornvale legacy. I do not know for certain, Ilara admitted, but it would explain a great deal. If there are survivors, others who escaped the war as children the way I did, they may have spent years gathering strength in the northern wilderness, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what they believe was stolen from them. And if that is true, my presence here, so close to the King of Karoth, could be seen as either a great betrayal or a valuable asset, depending on which side eventually finds me first. Draven's grip on her hand tightened, protective instinct flooding through him, alongside the ancient certainty of the mate bond that had revealed itself only the night before. No one will use you as a pawn in this conflict, not while I have breath in my body. You cannot promise that, Ilara said softly. You are a king. Your first duty is to Karoth, not to me. My duty to Karoth includes protecting every person within its walls who has proven their loyalty through years of honest service, Draven said firmly. And beyond duty, Alara, there is the matter of what happened last night in that clearing. You felt it too. I know you did. The bond does not choose one person alone. Alara closed her eyes, and for a long moment she said nothing, her hand still resting in his despite everything she had just confessed. I felt it, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I have felt something building between us for weeks now, long before last night confirmed what my instincts already suspected. I was frightened of it, before I even understood what it truly meant, because I always knew that if you discovered who I really was, everything would change. It has changed, Draven said gently, but not in the way you fear. Alara Thornvale, or Alara Voss, the woman who has stood beside me for months, who saved my life more than once, who I have come to trust and admire more than anyone else in this court. That woman has not changed simply because I now know her true name. A single tear finally escaped, sliding down her cheek before she could stop it, and Draven reached up to gently brush it away, his touch lingering against her skin far longer than propriety demanded. The court will not see it so simply, she said, though there was less conviction in her voice now, as if some small part of her wanted desperately to believe his reassurance, despite every instinct telling her to remain cautious. Then we will face the court together, when the time is right, Draven said. But first, I need you to help me understand what we are truly facing. If Thornvale is rebuilding, if there are others out there who share your bloodline, and perhaps a very different set of intentions, I need every piece of knowledge you can offer me. Not because I do not trust you, but because I refuse to let this kingdom, or you, fall into a conflict we do not fully understand. Alara nodded slowly, wiping the last traces of tears from her face, some of her old composure returning, even as something new and fragile settled between them, an understanding that had not existed before that morning. There is someone who might know more, she said after a moment. A man named Corwin, who served my father before the war. If he survived, if he is somehow connected to these recent attacks, he would know exactly what remains of the Thornvale line, and what they intend to do next. Then we find Corwin, Draven said, rising to his feet and offering his hand to help her up from the cold stone steps. Together. She hesitated only a moment before accepting his hand, and as their fingers intertwined, Draven felt the same stirring warmth he had felt the very first night they met, the mate bond settling more firmly into place with every passing moment they spent honest with one another. Whatever conflict lay ahead, whatever danger the rebuilding Thornvale forces might bring to Karoth's borders, he knew now, with absolute certainty, that he would face it with Alara at his side, not simply as his guard, but as the woman fate itself had chosen to walk beside him through whatever storms were still to come. They walked back toward the castle together in the fading morning light, the weight of secrets finally lifted between them, though the greater dangers still waiting on the horizon remained as uncertain and threatening as ever. Before they left the castle grounds for the Whisperwood, Draven insisted on assembling a small, trusted company to accompany them, unwilling to risk traveling into the wilderness with only the two of them despite Alara's assurance that Corwin posed no threat. Cassian volunteered immediately, though his expression made clear he still had reservations about the wisdom of the king, riding out so soon after an ambush had nearly claimed his life. You are certain this old man can be trusted? Cassian asked Alara quietly, as they prepared their horses in the early morning light, the castle still shrouded in mist. Corwin served my father faithfully for over a decade, Alara answered, checking the girth on her saddle with practiced hands. He risked everything to search for survivors after the war ended, myself included, though he did not find me until years later, long after I had already built a new life under a different name. If anyone in the Northern Territories knows the truth about what remains of the old Thornvale line, it is him. And if he does not welcome our arrival? Cassian pressed, clearly still uneasy about riding into unknown territory, on the word of a man none of them had met. Then we will deal with that possibility when it arises, Draven said, swinging up onto his horse. But I trust Alara's judgment in this matter. She has earned that much, at the very least. The ride toward the Whisperwood was quieter than Draven expected, the small company moving with practiced caution through terrain that had so recently proven dangerous. Alara led much of the way, her knowledge of hidden paths and old landmarks suggesting a familiarity with the forest that went beyond simple guard training, though she offered little explanation, beyond vague references to years spent traveling through similar terrain during her youth. They passed the site of the recent ambush along the way, the churned earth and broken arrows still visible evidence of the violence that had unfolded there only nights before. Alara's expression tightened as they rode past, but she said nothing, urging her horse onward at a slightly quickened pace, as if eager to leave the reminder behind them. Cassian fell back to ride beside Draven as the terrain grew denser, lowering his voice so only the king could hear. "She knows this forest better than any guard should, your majesty. Better than most scouts even." "I am aware," Draven said quietly, watching Alara's confident navigation through the thickening trees ahead of them. "There is a great deal about her I am only now beginning to understand." "Should I be concerned?" Cassian asked, his tone carefully neutral, despite the obvious worry beneath it. Draven considered the question seriously before answering. "I do not believe so. But I will tell you everything, once I understand it fully myself. For now, I ask only that you trust my judgment, as you always have." Cassian nodded slowly, though the concern did not entirely leave his expression as they continued deeper into the Whisperwood, following Alara toward whatever truths waited for them in the hidden cabin ahead. The old man's hands shook as he opened the door of his hidden cabin, deep in the Whisperwood, and the moment his eyes landed on Alara, he dropped to his knees on the wooden floor, as though the years had suddenly fallen away, and she was still the small child he remembered from before the war. "Little Flame," he whispered, using a name Draven had never heard before. "I thought you were lost with the rest of them." Corwin was older than Draven expected, his beard gray and his hands weathered from decades of hiding in the northern wilderness, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing, as they flicked between Alara and the king standing beside her. He rose slowly, using the doorframe for support, and ushered them both inside without another word, glancing nervously at the tree line before securing the door behind them. "You should not have come here," he said once they were seated around a small fire, the cabin cramped but warm against the evening chill. "If anyone followed you, if anyone saw a king riding into these woods with only a handful of guards, you have put us all in terrible danger." "We were careful," Draven assured him, though he did not miss the way Alara's eyes had darkened with worry at the old man's warning. "We need information, Corwin, about the attacks along the border, about who might be behind the Thornvale symbols appearing at each ambush site." Corwin's expression grew grim, and he poked at the fire for a long moment before answering, as if gathering the courage to speak of things long buried. "There are survivors," he finally admitted, "more than I ever expected to find, scattered across the northern territories after the war ended. Most simply wanted peace, wanted to forget the darkness our old leadership had led us into, but not all of them." "Who?" Alara asked, her voice tight with tension. "A man named Hrothgar," Corwin said. "He was a young commander during the final years of the war, ambitious and ruthless even by Thornvale standards. He escaped the final battle and has spent the last 5 years gathering the scattered remnants of our clan, promising them vengeance against Karoth, promising to reclaim what he calls our rightful territory." Corwin's gaze shifted to Alara, sorrow deepening the lines of his weathered face. "He has also spent years searching for any surviving members of the old chieftain's bloodline, believing that a legitimate heir would strengthen his claim and rally even the reluctant survivors to his cause." The color drained from Alara's face. "He is looking for me." "I fear so," Corwin said gently. "If Hrothgar discovers you are alive, and worse, that you have spent years serving within the very castle walls of the king who ended our clan's rule, he will see it as either the ultimate betrayal, deserving of severe punishment, or the perfect opportunity to force you into becoming the figurehead of his rebellion, whether you wish to be or not." Draven's jaw tightened, protective anger surging through him at the thought of anyone attempting to force Alara into anything against her will. "He will not have the chance," he said firmly. "Not while I have anything to say about it." Corwin studied him for a long moment, something calculating behind his tired eyes. "You care for her," he observed. "Not quite a question. More than a king typically cares for one of his guards." "She is my mate," Draven said simply, watching Alara's cheeks flush slightly at the plain admission, though she did not deny it. "Whatever Hrothgar intends, he will have to go through me first." "Then you must be prepared for exactly that," Corwin warned. "Hrothgar is not a fool. He has spent years building alliances with smaller clans, who still resent Karoth's rule, gathering weapons and warriors in the shadows, while your kingdom believed the Thornvale threat had been permanently extinguished. The recent attacks along your border were not random. They were tests, Your Majesty, meant to gauge the strength of your current defenses before a larger assault. How large an assault? Draven asked, dread settling heavy in his chest. Large enough to threaten the eastern provinces if your forces are not properly prepared, Corwin said grimly. Hrothgar has been recruiting for years. I would estimate his forces number in the hundreds now, possibly more, and they grow more confident with each successful raid that goes unanswered by significant retaliation. Draven rose from his seat, pacing the small cabin as his mind raced through the implications of what he had just learned. A rebuilding Thornvale force, led by a ruthless commander searching for Alara specifically, preparing for an assault large enough to threaten Karoth's eastern border. The peace his kingdom had fought so hard to secure over the past 5 years, hung by a thread that grew thinner with every passing day. We need to return to the castle, he said finally. I must alert my full council, mobilize additional forces along the eastern border, and prepare for the possibility that Hrothgar's assault could come sooner than we anticipated. There is something else, Corwin said quietly, his eyes fixed on Alara. Something you should know before you leave, Little Flame. Hrothgar has spies within Karoth's walls. I do not know how many, or how deeply embedded they are, but if he learns of your presence here today, learns that you have not only survived but allied yourself directly with the king, he may accelerate his plans significantly. You may have very little time before he acts. The ride back to the castle was tense and silent, both Draven and Alara lost in the weight of everything Corwin had revealed. As they approached the castle gates under the cover of darkness, Draven reached over and took Alara's hand, offering what comfort he could despite the growing storm gathering on the horizon. Whatever happens, he said quietly, we face it together. I meant what I said to Corwin. You are not simply my guard, Alara. You are my mate, and I will not allow Hrothgar or anyone else to use you as a pawn in whatever twisted vision of vengeance he has built for himself. I am frightened, Alara admitted, her voice barely audible over the sound of their horses' hooves against the castle road. Not for myself, but for what my presence here might cost this kingdom, and what it might cost you. Then let us face that fear together, rather than letting it separate us, Draven said firmly. They returned to find the castle, already stirring, with unusual activity, and Cassian met them in the courtyard, his expression grave. Your Majesty, we have received word from the eastern watchtowers. A significant force has been spotted, moving through the border territories, larger than anything we have encountered since the war's end. They are flying banners we do not recognize, though the design matches descriptions from the recent ambush sites. The Broken Crown, Draven said grimly. Yes, Your Majesty. Cassian's eyes flicked briefly to Alara before returning to the king. The scouts estimate their numbers at several hundred, moving with clear military discipline. This is not a raiding party. This looks like the beginning of a full invasion. The council chamber filled quickly, once word spread of the approaching threat. Nobles and military commanders alike gathering to hear Draven's assessment of the situation. He spoke carefully, revealing what Corwin had shared without exposing Alara's true identity to the full court, framing the information instead as intelligence gathered from a reliable informant in the Northern Territories. We have perhaps 3 days before Hrothgar's forces reach the eastern border in full strength, Draven said, studying the map spread across the council table, marked with troop positions and terrain features that would prove crucial in the coming conflict. I want every available soldier mobilized and moving toward the border by dawn. Cassian, I need you coordinating supply lines and reinforcements from the southern garrisons. We cannot afford to be caught unprepared. The room buzzed with urgent activity as commanders began issuing orders, messengers rushing out to spread word of the impending conflict throughout the kingdom. Amid the chaos, Draven caught Alara's eye across the chamber, and something passed between them, unspoken but understood. A promise that whatever came next, they would face it as partners, rather than simply king and guard. Later that night, as the castle prepared for war, Draven found Alara in the armory, checking her weapons with methodical precision, her expression far more composed than the fear he had witnessed in Corwin's cabin earlier that day. You do not have to fight in this battle, Draven said, watching her sharpen the edge of her blade with practiced strokes. No one would think less of you for stepping back, given everything Hrothgar's forces represent to you personally. Alara looked up at him, something fierce and determined burning in her golden eyes. This is exactly why I must fight, Draven. Hrothgar claims to fight for the memory of my family, for the legacy of a clan that I never truly knew, beyond the horror of its final destruction. He does not speak for me. He does not represent what remains of the Thornvale name. If I am going to reclaim any part of my heritage, it will not be through the violence and vengeance Hrothgar has built his rebellion upon. It will be by standing against him, by proving that not every survivor of that war chose the path of endless conflict. Then we fight together, Draven said, moving to stand beside her, his own weapon resting against the armory wall nearby. As equals, as partners bound by more than simple duty. As mates, Elara added softly, and the words settled between them with quiet, powerful certainty, a bond neither of them could deny any longer, regardless of the danger that awaited them both on the eastern border in the coming days. Outside the armory windows, the castle continued its urgent preparations for war, torches burning late into the night, as Karoth mobilized to defend against a threat that had risen from the ashes of a conflict everyone believed had ended years before. But within those walls, amid the growing danger, something rare and unshakable had taken root, between a king determined to protect his kingdom and the woman fate had chosen to stand beside him through whatever trials still lay ahead. Before departing Corwin's cabin, Elara lingered a moment at the door, looking back at the old man who had once served her father with such devotion. Will you be safe here, once word spreads that we came looking for answers? Corwin managed a tired smile. I have survived in these woods for 5 years, little flame. I will manage a while longer. But you should know, there may be others like me scattered through these territories, old Thornvale servants who never joined Hrothgar's cause, who simply wanted to live out their remaining years in peace. If you truly intend to rebuild something worthwhile from the ashes of our clan's legacy, they may prove valuable allies rather than threats. I will remember that, Elara said softly, and for a moment, something passed between them that Draven recognized as the quiet grief of survivors who had lost nearly everything and found, against all odds, a small piece of their old life still standing. As they rode back through the darkening forest, Draven found himself studying Elara more closely, noting the tension in her shoulders that had not fully eased since their conversation with Corwin. You do not have to carry this alone, he said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them since leaving the cabin. I have carried it alone for most of my life, Elara admitted. It is difficult to imagine any other way. Then let this be the beginning of a different way, Draven said. Whatever comes next, whatever Hrothgar intends, you will not face it as the last surviving heir of a broken clan, hunted and alone. You will face it as my mate, with the full strength of Karoth standing behind you. Elara said nothing for a long moment, but when she finally looked at him, something in her expression had shifted. A weight lifted, however slightly, from shoulders that had carried far too much for far too long. The full council convened again the following morning, and this time Draven made the difficult decision to reveal Elara's heritage to a smaller circle of his most trusted advisors, understanding that they could not adequately prepare for Hrothgar's forces without acknowledging the full truth of what was at stake. The reactions varied from cautious concern to genuine surprise, but none of his closest advisors reacted with the hostility Elara had feared. It changes little in terms of our military strategy, one of the senior generals observed after the initial shock had passed. Hrothgar's forces are a threat regardless of the Queen's heritage. If anything, her knowledge of Thornvale tactics and territory gives us an advantage we would not otherwise possess. Elara herself contributed extensively to the strategic planning that followed, her insight into Thornvale's traditional battle formations and the psychological weaknesses within Hrothgar's likely command structure, proving invaluable as Karoth's commanders finalized their defensive positions along the eastern border. She spoke of old rivalries within the northern clans that Hrothgar had likely papered over rather than resolved, alliances built on fear and shared grievance rather than genuine loyalty, weaknesses that skilled negotiators might exploit, even amid open conflict. If we can demonstrate strength without excessive cruelty, she suggested during one lengthy strategy session, some of the smaller clans currently allied with Hrothgar, out of necessity rather than conviction, may choose to withdraw rather than commit fully to a battle they never truly wanted to fight. Cassian, who had grown increasingly impressed with Elara's strategic mind over the preceding days, nodded thoughtfully. A war fought with mercy as well as strength. It is not the approach your father's war against Thornvale employed, Your Majesty. But perhaps it is precisely the approach this new conflict requires. As preparations continued throughout the castle, Draven found quiet moments with Alara increasingly precious amid the mounting tension. They walked together in the evenings, when duties allowed, no longer bothering to disguise their closeness as mere security briefings, the court having largely accepted the growing bond between king and guard, even before its true nature had been fully explained. "I keep thinking of the children," Alara admitted one evening, as they stood together on the same balcony, where their bond had first begun to take shape months before. "The ones caught in the middle of this, on both sides. I was one of them once. I do not want more children to grow up the way I did, orphaned by a war neither generation fully understood. Then we will do everything within our power to ensure this conflict ends as swiftly and mercifully as possible," Draven said, drawing her close. "Hrothgar's ambitions will not go unanswered, but neither will we repeat the excesses of the war that created him in the first place." Word arrived 2 days before Karoth's forces were set to march, that Hrothgar's army had begun moving faster than initially anticipated, forcing a hurried acceleration of the kingdom's own preparations. Draven spent long hours in the war room studying troop positions and supply lines, while Alara trained relentlessly in the yards, preparing not only her body but her mind for the confrontation that seemed increasingly unavoidable with each passing hour. On the final night before their forces were set to depart for the eastern border, Draven found Alara alone in the castle chapel, kneeling before the old stone altar, where soldiers had prayed for courage and protection for generations, before either of them had been born. "I did not expect to find you here," Draven said quietly, settling beside her. "I am not entirely certain what I believe about the old gods," Alara admitted, "but tonight felt like a night to ask for their favor regardless." She turned to look at him, her golden eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Draven, I want you to know that these past months, whatever secrets and fears came with them, have been the truest happiness I have known since before that night my mother pushed me into hiding and told me to run. You will know many more such nights," Draven said firmly, taking her hands in his. "This war will end, Alara, and when it does, we will build a peace worthy of everything you have sacrificed to reach this moment." They remained together in the quiet chapel long into the night, drawing strength from each other ahead of the battle that would determine not only the fate of Karoth, but the possibility of finally laying to rest a conflict that had already claimed far too many lives across 2 generations. Dawn broke over the eastern plains with the sound of war horns echoing across the valley, and Draven sat astride his horse at the front of Karoth's assembled forces, watching Hrothgar's army emerge from the tree line in the distance, their numbers dark and sprawling against the pale morning light. Beside him, Alara sat mounted on her own horse, her expression calm despite the enormity of what was about to unfold, her bow strung and ready across her back. "Are you prepared for this?" Draven asked quietly, studying her profile in the early light. "I have been preparing for this my entire life, whether I knew it or not," Alara replied, her voice steady. "Today, we end Hrothgar's vision of endless vengeance, and we prove that the Thornvale name does not have to mean what he has twisted it into." Cassian rode up beside them, his own expression grim but resolute. "Our forces are in position, Your Majesty. The eastern flank is secured by the mounted cavalry, and the archers hold the ridge above the valley. Whenever you give the command." Draven studied the approaching enemy forces one final time, noting the coordinated formations, the discipline that Hrothgar had clearly instilled in his gathered warriors over years of careful preparation. This would not be an easy victory, if victory came at all, but Karoth had faced impossible odds before and endured. "Signal the advance," Draven commanded, and the war horns sounded once more, echoing across the valley, as Karoth's forces began their measured march toward the waiting enemy. The battle that followed was chaos given form, steel ringing against steel as the 2 forces collided in the open plain, the ground churning beneath thousands of feet as soldiers on both sides fought with desperate intensity. Draven fought near the front lines, his beast nature fully unleashed, cutting through enemy ranks with practiced skill honed by years of training he had hoped never to need again. Beside him, whenever the chaos allowed, Alara fought with equal ferocity, her arrows finding their marks with deadly precision, before she abandoned her bow for closer combat as the enemy pressed in around them. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline, the tide of battle shifting first one way, and then another, as both sides refused to yield ground easily. Draven caught glimpses of Hrothgar himself across the battlefield, a tall, imposing figure whose beast form radiated barely contained fury as he cut through Karoth's ranks with brutal efficiency, clearly searching for something, or someone, amid the chaos. It was inevitable, perhaps, that Hrothgar would eventually spot Alara among the fighting, and when he did, his entire demeanor shifted, rage, and something almost like desperate hope crossing his features as he abandoned his current opponents and began cutting a direct path through the battlefield toward her. "Thornvale blood," Hrothgar bellowed, his voice carrying across the chaos, even as steel continued to clash around them. "You live. After all these years, you finally reveal yourself, hiding within the very walls of the kingdom that destroyed everything we once were." "I am not hiding anymore," Alara called back, standing her ground as Hrothgar approached, Draven moving swiftly to her side despite the enemy soldiers still pressing in around them. "But I will not join your cause, Hrothgar. I will not lend the Thornvale name to a vision built on endless vengeance and the deaths of innocent people who had no part in whatever grievances you still carry." "You would side with them?" Hrothgar's voice cracked with fury and betrayal. "With the king whose father slaughtered our people, burned our homes, scattered our clan to the winds? You are the last true heir of our bloodline, and you would kneel before the very crown that destroyed us?" "I would not kneel before anyone," Alara said fiercely. "But I have seen what this kingdom has become in the years since the war, Hrothgar. I have seen a king who carries guilt for the lives lost, who works toward peace rather than conquest. Whatever darkness led our old leadership down the path that ended in that final battle, I will not let you repeat those same mistakes in my name." Hrothgar's expression twisted with rage, and he lunged forward, his beast form fully unleashed, claws extended as he attacked with the full force of years of bitter, festering hatred. Draven moved instinctively to intercept, placing himself between Alara and the charging warrior, his own beast nature rising to meet the challenge head-on. The fight between them was fierce and brutal, both warriors drawing on years of training and the desperate stakes of the battle raging around them. Hrothgar fought with the reckless fury of a man who had built his entire identity around vengeance, while Draven fought with the steady determination of a king protecting everything he had come to value: his kingdom, his people, and the woman who had become the other half of his very soul. The turning point came when Hrothgar, in his desperate fury, attempted a final reckless strike aimed directly at Alara, believing perhaps that removing the true heir from the battlefield would somehow validate the twisted cause he had built his rebellion upon. But Alara was ready, meeting his attack with a counter-move drawn from the very same ancient Thornvale techniques Hrothgar himself had trained in. Techniques she had spent years secretly mastering in memory of a family she barely remembered. Hrothgar fell, his own momentum and desperation working against him as Alara's counterstrike found its mark, ending the confrontation with swift, decisive finality. Around them, as word spread that their commander had fallen, Hrothgar's remaining forces began to waver, their disciplined formations breaking as confusion and doubt spread through their ranks. "Stand down," Alara called out to the retreating soldiers, her voice carrying clearly across the quieting battlefield. Hrothgar's vision died with him today. There is no honor left in continuing this fight, only more unnecessary death. Karoth offers mercy to those who lay down their weapons now. Slowly, hesitantly, Hrothgar's forces began to comply, weapons dropping to the churned earth as the remaining Thornvale warriors surrendered, rather than continue a fight they no longer believed in, without their commander's fury driving them forward. Draven watched with a mixture of exhaustion and profound relief, as the battle that had threatened to reignite years of painful conflict finally drew to a close, ended not through further bloodshed, but through the courage of the one person who had the most reason to hate both sides of the ancient rivalry, and chose instead to seek a different path entirely. In the days that followed, as Karoth worked to process the surrendered Thornvale warriors and negotiate terms that would prevent future conflict, word of Alara's true identity, and her decisive role in ending the battle, spread throughout the kingdom. Draven had feared the court's reaction, had worried that revealing her heritage might turn the very people she had sworn to protect against her, but instead, the story of her choice, of standing against her own bloodline's vengeance in favor of peace, earned her a respect throughout Karoth, that surprised even Draven himself. Cassian was the first among the nobility to formally acknowledge the shift, approaching Draven privately in the days following the battle. "The court speaks of nothing else," he said, a rare smile touching his usually serious features. The guard who was secretly the last heir of Thornvale, who chose loyalty to Karoth over vengeance for her own fallen clan. "It is the kind of story that ends wars and begins new eras, Your Majesty. You could not have asked for a better outcome, even if you had planned it from the very beginning." "I did not plan any of it," Draven admitted, watching from the castle balcony as Alara walked through the courtyard below, no longer hiding in the shadows of pillars, but walking openly among the soldiers and nobles who now regarded her with genuine respect, rather than mere tolerance. Fate, it seems, had its own plans for both of us. That evening, Draven called together his full council and the assembled nobility of Karoth for a formal announcement, one he had been planning carefully in the days since the battle's end. Alara stood beside him at the head of the great hall, dressed not in her guard uniform, but in fine robes that befit her true station, her golden eyes bright with a mixture of nervousness and quiet strength, as the court gathered to hear the king's words. 5 years ago, this kingdom fought a war that ended one chapter of conflict while unknowingly beginning another, Draven began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. That war left scars on both sides, wounds that nearly reopened in recent days, through the actions of those who could not release their grip on old vengeance. But it was also through that same conflict that I came to know a woman whose courage and integrity exceeded anything I have witnessed in my years as king. He turned to face Alara directly, taking her hand before the assembled court, feeling her fingers tighten around his with quiet trust. "Alara Thornvale has served this kingdom faithfully for months as my personal guard, protecting my life on more than one occasion, at great personal risk." When her true heritage was revealed, rather than seize the opportunity to claim vengeance many would have considered justified, she chose instead to stand against those who would have used her bloodline for further violence. She chose Karoth. She chose peace. Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobility, but Draven continued before any dissent could take root. "Beyond her service and her courage, I have discovered something else in the months I have come to know Alara. She is my mate, bonded to me, not through political arrangement or royal decree, but through the ancient bond that our beast heritage recognizes as absolute and unbreakable. I intend to make her my queen, not despite her heritage, but because of the strength and wisdom that heritage has given her." The hall fell silent for a long moment before Cassian, ever the loyal advisor, stepped forward and knelt before them both, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet chamber. "Long live the queen." One by one, the assembled nobility followed his lead, kneeling before Draven and Alara in acknowledgement of what had just been declared, the ancient bond between king and mate now formally recognized before the entire court. Alara's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she watched the transformation unfold before her, the shadows she had hidden within for so many years, finally giving way to the light of open acceptance and genuine respect. "You did not have to say all of that," Alara whispered to Draven as the court began to rise, murmurs of celebration replacing the earlier tension. "Every word was true," Draven said softly, drawing her close, despite the watching eyes of the court. "You are no longer the quiet guard standing silently in the shadows, Alara. You are the queen this kingdom needs, someone who understands both the cost of war and the true value of peace." Outside the castle walls, as evening settled over Karoth, the kingdom began to heal from the conflict that had so nearly reignited old wounds, guided now by a king and queen bound together not simply by duty or political necessity, but by an ancient bond that had proven, in the end, stronger than any vengeance or old hatred could ever hope to be. The broken crown of Thornvale, once a symbol of destruction and endless conflict, would be remembered instead through the woman who had chosen a different path entirely, stepping out of the shadows to claim not vengeance, but a future built on the very peace her ancestors had once threatened to destroy. In the weeks following the surrender, Karoth faced the delicate work of integrating the defeated Thornvale remnant into a kingdom still learning to trust the very name that had once haunted its collective memory. Draven established a formal commission, led jointly by Cassian and Alara, to oversee the resettlement of former rebels, ensuring that those who had followed Hrothgar out of desperation or misplaced loyalty rather than genuine malice, were given fair opportunity to rebuild their lives within Karoth's borders, rather than facing indiscriminate punishment. Not every surrendered warrior proved trustworthy, and the commission uncovered a handful of individuals still loyal to Hrothgar's vision, even after his death, quietly attempting to reorganize resistance among the more disillusioned prisoners. Elara handled these cases personally, drawing on her own understanding of the desperation and grief that could drive someone toward extremism, offering genuine paths toward redemption to those willing to take them, while ensuring that those who remained committed to violence faced appropriate consequences under Karoth's laws. It would be easier to simply execute anyone who shows the slightest hint of continued loyalty to Hrothgar's cause, Cassian observed one afternoon, reviewing the commission's latest reports with a mixture of admiration and mild exasperation at the sheer amount of careful diplomatic work the process required. Yet you insist on hearing each case individually, weighing circumstances the old council would never have bothered considering. Easier does not always mean wiser, Elara replied, not looking up from the report in front of her. Hrothgar built his following from years of unaddressed grief and grievance. If we simply replace his violence with our own, however justified it might feel in the moment, we only plant the seeds for the next Hrothgar to rise from the same soil a generation from now. I would rather do the harder work now, so that our children do not inherit this same conflict the way I inherited it from my parents. Cassian said nothing for a long moment, simply studying her with newfound respect, before finally nodding and returning to his own portion of the reports without further argument. As spring gave way to summer, Karoth's eastern border, once a source of constant anxiety and periodic violence, began to transform into something Draven had scarcely dared hope for during the darkest days of the recent conflict. Trade caravans moved freely between Karoth's settled territories and the northern clan lands, their passage no longer shadowed by fear of ambush. Small villages that had once stood abandoned, their populations having fled during years of uncertainty, slowly began to see families return, rebuilding homes and re-establishing the quiet rhythms of daily life that war had so thoroughly disrupted. Elara made a point of visiting these border communities personally whenever her duties allowed, listening to their concerns, and ensuring that the peace being negotiated in Karoth's Grand Council chambers translated into meaningful change for those who had suffered most directly from the decades of conflict between the kingdom and the northern clans. Her presence, the daughter of the very clan whose war had once devastated these same communities, sent a powerful message that resonated far beyond anything formal treaties or royal decrees could accomplish on their own. "They look at you differently than they look at me," Draven observed during one such visit to a small farming village near the border, watching as local children gathered curiously around Elara, drawn by stories that had already begun to spread, of the guard-turned-queen who had ended a war through courage rather than further bloodshed. "You have become something of a legend among them already." "I am simply someone who understands what they have lost," Elara said, watching the children with a soft smile that Draven had come to treasure more than any formal court ceremony. That understanding matters more to them than any crown or title ever could. The formal coronation ceremony, when it finally took place, drew nobility and clan representatives alike from across the region, a gathering that would have seemed impossible only a year before, when suspicion and old grievances still defined relations between Karoth and its northern neighbors. Draven stood beside Elara as the kingdom's high priest placed the ceremonial crown upon her head, formally recognizing her not simply as his mate, but as queen in her own right, entitled to every authority and responsibility that title carried. Isolde of the Grey Wolf clan, now a frequent visitor to Karoth's court and one of Elara's closest allies among the northern representatives, watched the ceremony with evident satisfaction. "Your ancestors would be proud," she said quietly to Elara afterward, during the celebration that followed the formal proceedings. "Not simply for reclaiming a measure of the honor your clan lost during the war, but for building something far more valuable than mere honor. You have built lasting peace, something few rulers in either of our histories ever truly managed to achieve." "I could not have done it without Draven," Elara said, glancing toward her husband, who stood nearby, engaged in conversation with several visiting dignitaries, though his attention kept drifting back toward her throughout the celebration. "Or without people like you, willing to extend trust, even when old wounds made trust difficult to offer." As the celebration continued long into the evening, Draven found a quiet moment to pull Elara aside, away from the crowds of well-wishers and celebrating nobility, to a private balcony overlooking the illuminated castle grounds below. "Do you remember the first time I found you on a balcony like this one?" he asked, drawing her close as music and laughter drifted up from the courtyard below. "I remember," Alara said softly. "I remember being terrified that you had discovered something about me I was not yet ready to share." "And now?" Draven asked. "Now I understand that everything I was so afraid you would discover became the very thing that brought us together in the first place," Alara said, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the celebration continue below. "My past did not need to remain hidden forever, Draven. It simply needed the right person, willing to see past the fear, to the truth underneath." They remained on the balcony together long after the formal celebrations had ended, watching the last torches gradually extinguish across the castle grounds, secure in a peace that neither of them could have imagined possible during those first uncertain days, when duty and instinct had first drawn them toward each other, unaware that fate itself had already begun weaving their destinies together, long before either of them fully understood what that destiny would ultimately demand, and ultimately reward. Rain hammered against the castle windows the night the northern envoys arrived unannounced, and Alara was on her feet before the guard at the door had even finished announcing them, old instincts still sharp despite the months that had passed since the war's end. Draven placed a steadying hand on her arm, a silent reminder that she no longer needed to react as a guard first, and a queen second, though he understood why the habit lingered. The envoys came from the scattered clans of the north, small factions who had watched the fall of Hrothgar's rebellion with cautious interest, uncertain whether Karoth's mercy toward the surrendered Thornvale warriors had been genuine or merely a temporary calculation. Their leader, a weathered woman named Isolde who represented what remained of the Grey Wolf clan, studied Alara with open curiosity as she was led into the throne room. "They say the last Thornvale heir sits beside the king of Karoth," Isolde said, her tone neither hostile nor friendly, simply assessing. "Many in the north did not believe it until we saw the proof with our own eyes." "Believe it," Alara said calmly, standing beside Draven, with the quiet confidence she had grown into since the battle, "and believe also that Karoth has no interest in repeating the mistakes of the past. We seek alliance with the northern clans, not conquest." Isolde studied her for a long moment before finally nodding, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "The Grey Wolf clan has watched Karoth's borders for 5 years, waiting to see what kind of kingdom would rise from the ashes of that war. Perhaps it is time we stopped waiting and started building something new instead." The negotiations that followed stretched across several days, Ilara's knowledge of northern customs and old clan hierarchies proving invaluable in bridging the gap between Karoth's formal court traditions and the more direct, honor-based negotiations the northern clans preferred. Draven watched with quiet pride as she navigated conversations that would have stumped even his most experienced diplomats, her unique position as both Karoth's queen and a daughter of the north, giving her an authority no one else in the castle could claim. By the time Isolde and her delegation departed, they carried with them the framework of a new treaty, one that promised trade, mutual defense, and an end to the decades of suspicion that had lingered since the war. It was not peace built overnight, but it was a beginning, and Draven understood that such beginnings mattered more than any grand declaration ever could. Word of the successful negotiations spread quickly, and in the weeks that followed, smaller delegations from other scattered clans began arriving at Karoth's gates, each seeking to establish their own understanding with the kingdom that had once been their enemy. Alara met with each one personally, and slowly, carefully, the deep wounds left by the old war began to close, replaced by something neither side had dared hope for in the years immediately following the conflict. Not everyone within Karoth's own court welcomed the changes easily. Lord Vantry, an aging noble who had lost 2 sons in the original war against Thornvale, made his objections known during a particularly tense council session, his voice sharp with old grief that had never fully healed. "You would have us forge alliances with the very people who once sought our destruction," he said, glaring across the council table at Alara, though his anger seemed aimed as much at his own unresolved pain as at the queen herself. "My sons died fighting against the Thornvale banner, and now we are meant to welcome their descendants as friends?" The room fell silent, tension thick in the air, as everyone waited to see how Alara would respond to the pointed accusation. She did not flinch, nor did she respond with anger. though Draven could see the effort it cost her to remain calm. "I lost my entire family that same night, Lord Vantry," she said quietly. "My mother, my father, everyone I knew before the age of 7. Gone in a single battle neither of us chose to fight. I understand grief. I understand the desire to hold on to anger, because it feels safer than the alternative, because forgiveness sometimes feels like betraying the memory of those we lost." She paused, meeting his gaze directly. "But I have also learned that endless grief passed down through generations only breeds more of the same violence that took our loved ones in the first place. I am not asking you to forget your sons, Lord Vantry. I am asking you to consider whether continuing to fight the same war, generation after generation, would honor their memory, or simply ensure that other families suffer the same loss we did." Lord Vantry said nothing for a long moment, old pain warring visibly with the logic of her words, and though he did not offer immediate forgiveness or agreement, he also did not raise further objections that day. It was a small victory, but Draven recognized it as significant, another crack in the old walls of resentment that Alara's presence and wisdom continued to slowly dismantle throughout the kingdom. As the seasons changed and Karoth settled into its newfound stability, Draven found himself reflecting often on how dramatically his life had shifted since that first night Alara had stopped an assassin's blade before it could reach his throat. He had been a king shaped primarily by loss and duty, carrying the weight of his father's war and his own uncertain place within a peace he had not been entirely sure he could maintain. Alara had changed that, not simply through the ancient bond that connected them, but through her own quiet strength, her willingness to face painful truths rather than hide from them, and her unwavering commitment to building something better from the wreckage of old conflicts. Their bond deepened with each passing month, tested occasionally by the demands of rulership but never weakened by them. Where other royal marriages might have been built on political convenience, theirs had been forged through genuine trust, established long before either of them fully understood the ancient connection drawing them together. Draven found that he trusted Alara's counsel not simply because their bond compelled him to, but because her judgment, tempered by both hardship and hard-won wisdom, consistently proved sound in matters both large and small. The following spring brought new challenges, as it always did, for a kingdom still finding its footing after years of conflict. But Karoth faced each one with a resilience born of the hard lessons learned during the recent war. Trade routes reopened with the northern clans, bringing new prosperity to border towns that had suffered under years of uncertainty. Young beast warriors from both Karoth and the northern territories began training together, a symbolic gesture that spoke to a future built on cooperation, rather than the ancient rivalries that had defined the region for generations. Alara took on the role of queen, with a dedication that surprised even those who had watched her prove herself repeatedly during the war. She established a council specifically focused on integrating displaced clan members back into stable society, drawing on her own experience as someone who had lost everything and had to rebuild an entirely new life from nothing. Under her guidance, former Thornvale warriors who had once followed Hrothgar into rebellion found paths toward honest work and genuine belonging within Karoth's expanding borders, rather than facing the punishment or exile many had feared. "You have given them something Hrothgar never could," Draven observed one evening, watching from their private chambers, as Alara reviewed reports detailing the successful resettlement of nearly 200 former rebels into productive roles throughout the kingdom. "A future worth building, instead of a past worth avenging. I understand what it feels like to have nothing left but grief and anger," Alara said, setting the reports aside as he joined her by the window overlooking the moonlit courtyard below. "It is easy to let that consume everything else, to build an entire identity around vengeance, because the alternative feels like admitting the loss meant nothing. I simply wanted to show them there is another way forward, one that does not require forgetting what happened, only refusing to let it define everything that comes after." Draven wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin against the top of her head, as they both looked out over the kingdom they had worked so hard to heal. "My father would have been proud of the peace you have built here, Alara. Prouder perhaps than anything achieved through the war he fought to end the original conflict." "Our peace," Alara corrected gently, turning in his embrace to face him directly, her golden eyes soft with an affection that had grown steadily since that first uncertain night on the castle balcony. "We built this together, Draven. every piece of it. As the anniversary of their formal union approached, preparations began throughout Caroth for a celebration unlike anything the kingdom had witnessed in generations. A festival meant not simply to honor the king and queen, but to celebrate the broader peace that had finally settled across the northern territories after decades of intermittent conflict. Delegations arrived from every corner of the region, former enemies now sitting together at shared tables, their children playing together in the castle courtyards, without the weight of old grudges shadowing their futures. Standing on the same balcony where Draven had first found Elara staring at the moonlight so many months before, the two of them watched the celebration unfold below, torches and lanterns, illuminating a courtyard filled with laughter and music, from cultures that had once viewed each other with nothing but suspicion and fear. "Do you remember what you told me that first night?" Draven asked, his hand finding hers, as they watched the festivities continue below. "I told you I acted out of duty to Caroth, not loyalty to its king," Elara said, a small smile touching her lips at the memory. "And now?" Draven asked, though he already knew the answer, could feel it in the steady warmth of the bond that connected them, stronger now than it had ever been in those uncertain early days. "Now I understand that duty to Caroth and loyalty to you were never truly separate things," Elara said softly. "They became the same purpose, the same heart, somewhere along the way, though I could not have told you exactly when that happened." Draven pulled her close, and together they watched the kingdom they had built continue to celebrate long into the night, a testament to what could be achieved when old wounds were finally allowed to heal. When vengeance gave way to understanding, and when two people, bound by fate and strengthened by choice, found in each other not simply a mate, but a true partner, capable of transforming even the deepest scars of war into the foundation for something far more lasting than either of them could have imagined on that first fateful night in the throne room of Caroth. The kingdom prospered in the years that followed, its borders secure, its people united, and its rulers forever remembered, not for the war that had once defined their history, but for the peace they had chosen to build in its place. One honest conversation, one difficult truth, and one unwavering act of trust at a time.